Welcome back to Story Time with Someone Else's Mom. With me, Someone Else's Mom. Today, we're reading Chapter 6 of Edward Eager's classic, Half Magic. Now, fun fact, I already recorded this, only to get up and find out that the whole thing didn't record, so at least I got a practice run in. However, this is one of those longer chapters, so we're going to break it into 2 installments. Let's find out what happened to Jane. The dinner with Mr. Smith and the evening that followed were an almost complete success. And the biggest success of the evening for Mark and Katherine and Martha was Mr. Smith himself. The 4 children generally divided all grown-ups into 4 classes. There were the ones like Miss Bick and Uncle Edward and Aunt Grace and Mrs. Hudson, who, frankly, and as cool as it might be to say it, just weren't good with children at all. There was nothing to do about these, the 4 children felt, except be as polite as possible and hope they would go away soon. Then there were the ones like Miss Mamie King, who, when they were with children, always seemed to want to pretend they were children too. This was no doubt kindly meant, but often ended with the 4 children's feeling embarrassed for them. Somewhat better were the opposite ones, who went around treating children as though the children were as grown up as they were themselves. This was flattering, but sometimes a strain to live up to. Many of the 4 children's school teachers fell into this class. Last and best and rarest of all were the ones who seemed to feel that children were children and grown-ups were grown-ups, and that was that. And yet at the same time, there wasn't any reason why they couldn't get along perfectly well and naturally together, and even occasionally communicate without changing that fact. Mr. Smith turned out to be one of these. He allowed and even urged the 4 children to choose anything they wanted from the menu at dinner, while at the same time frankly advising Mark that he thought he would enjoy a rare steak and fried onions more than he would codfish tongues. Jane said she wasn't very hungry and would her mother order something for her, please. And no, she didn't think she cared for any dessert, thank you. The other 3 stared at her in disbelief. And after dinner came the ride home, and that was exciting, for not everyone in those days owned a motor car, and the 4 children were among ones who didn't. Remember, 90 years ago. Yeah, like that. Mr. Smith showed them the way to shift from high into second without stopping, and Mark thought this almost as magical as anything the charm had done for them so far. Jane said she'd seen it before. The other 3 thought this rude of her, and it was. When they arrived at home, Mr. Smith proved an adept player of Fan-Tan and I Doubt It. And when card-playing palled, was enthralling in his description of his travels in darkest Australia. If you have heard of Fan-Tan and I Doubt It, please put it in the comments. Never heard of them. Old games, I'm guessing. Jane said she was tired and didn't feel like playing games or talking, and she guessed she'd go to bed and finish Hildegard's Harvest instead. The other 3 looked at each other and decided that they had better have a word with Jane later on. But when at last, very late, they were sent to bed and stopped to peek into her room, she was asleep, or pretending to be. And the next morning, they didn't get a chance to ask her what had been the matter, because next morning was Saturday, and Saturday mornings in that house were always a thing of frenzy. On Saturdays, the children's mother came home from work early, and Miss Bick stayed only half a day, and those were 2 good things about Saturday. But on Saturdays, Miss Bick always seemed bent on cramming a whole day's fussing and nagging into one morning, and today the 4 children were kept so busy polishing silver and cleaning out bureau drawers and dusting and doing errands that they scarcely had time to exchange a word if 2 of them met by chance in the hall. So it wasn't until along toward lunchtime that 1 or 2 and finally 3 and 4 were able to gather together in Katherine and Martha's room and examine the outlook of the day. The outlook of the day naturally hinged on the charm and what they were going to do next with it. "There's one thing bothers me," Martha was saying to Katherine, as Mark and then Jane joined them. "When I was only half there, where did the other half of me go?" "Don't," said Katherine. "That's one of those questions that gives you a headache just to think about, like which came first, the chicken or the egg." "All the same," said Mark, sitting down next to them, "it might be fun to find out." we wish ourselves there? Catherine's eyes were round. Wherever it is? I don't want to, said Martha. It might be just nowhere at all. We might be just nothingness. If we were, we wouldn't know it, Mark pointed out. But that's worse. Then we'd never get back at all, cried Martha, getting excited. I don't want to not know it. I don't want to be just nothingness. If we wish that, I won't come. Well, you won't have to because we aren't going to, said Jane, speaking for the first time. She walked over to the secret place and took out the charm. It's my turn next, and I don't feel like wishing. I may not make a wish for years or in years, if ever. And putting the charm in her pocket, she started for the door. What's the matter with you? Said Mark, getting up to follow. Oh, nothing at all, said Jane, turning on him. Not a thing. Everything's just wonderful. Everything's just fine and dandy. Everything's just hunky-dory. Well, isn't it? Said Katherine. Everything's just spoiled, that's all, Jane cried. Everything's just utterly and completely ruined, all because some people have to tell everything they know. And she glared at Martha. What did I do? Said Martha. As if you didn't know, said Jane. Here I thought we were going to have a wonderful, exciting, secret summer, all full of thrilling adventures, and you had to go and tell the whole thing to the first old stranger that came along. You mean Mr. Smith? Said Martha, surprised. He's not a stranger anymore. He's a friend. Oh, he is he? Said Jane. That makes it all just lovely, doesn't it? And now I suppose we'll have grown-ups butting in and telling us what to wish all the time, and like as not, wanting to borrow the charm and wasting its substance on their own vices and desires. And it's all just utterly and completely ruined. And she went down the hall and into her own room and shut the door. The others stared after her, amazed. Doesn't she like Mr. Smith? Said Martha. No, said Mark. I don't think she does. In her room, Jane sat on the bed and gave way to gloom. She felt awful inside, the way you always do when you've been perfectly hateful to those you love best, and she didn't even know why she'd done it. She didn't know why the mere thought of Mr. Smith upset her so, or if she did know the reason, she didn't want to admit it, even to herself. But the thing was, Jane was the only one of the 4 children who really remembered their father. Martha was only a baby when their father died, and Katherine and Eve and Mark were still very young, too young for them to recall very much about him now. But Jane remembered him clearly, and with such a great deal of love. It was for that reason she couldn't bear the thought of Mr. Smith's coming into their lives and getting to know them better and better, and finally growing to be just like one of the family, and even trying to take place of a father to them, which was what she was perfectly sure Mr. Smith intended to do. So now she sat in her room and thought and felt thoroughly miserable. Even the presence of the charm in her pocket was no comfort, because while it would serve the others right if she made a wish all by herself, the only wishes she could think of were making horrible, murderous ones. And she was old enough and nice enough to know that wishing herself invisible and going and pulling Mr. Smith's beard or writing him a threatening letter with a pen dipped in blood wouldn't really be a bit of help or make her feel any better. After a few minutes, there was a knock at the door, and Mark and Katherine and Martha trooped in, looking solemn. We've been thinking, Mark said, and we thought we ought to hold a council. About Mr. Smith, said Martha. Go away, said Jane. You'd like him if you really got to know him, said Mark. He was lots of fun last night. Said Jane. He was a big help when I wasn't all there, said Martha. He's sensible about magic, not like most grown-ups at all. Ha, said Jane. So we were thinking, said Katherine, and then stopped, looking at Mark. Well, said Jane. You tell her, said Katherine to Mark. We were thinking, said Mark, that maybe before we make another wish, we ought to go see Mr. Smith and sort of ask his advice, just, in a general way. What? Said Jane. I think we ought to take him along in the wish with us, said Martha. Then he could help us out again if we get in more trouble. The way we always seem to, said Katherine. Then you could really get to know him, said Mark. And everything would be all right again, said Martha. Jane was looking at them as though she could not believe her ears. "Has everyone in this family gone completely and utterly insane?" she cried. "Don't you know why he's so interested in us and nice about things? Haven't you seen the way he and Mother keep looking at each other? Do you want some old stepfather moving in here and changing everything?" The others looked surprised at this, but not really terribly shocked. "I should think he might make kind of an ideal one," said Katherine. "It's good for a growing boy, having a man around the house," said Mark. "I've always wished I had a father," said Martha. Now Jane began to storm. "Do you really think he could take Father's place? Him and his old beard. Don't you know what stepfathers always turn out to be like once the fatal deed is done? Don't you remember Mr. Murdstone?" "Ah!" she cried, glaring round at them all. "It's no use. You don't understand. I wish—" She broke off in alarm, remembering the charm. Then, a prey to utter recklessness, she plunged her hand into her pocket, grasped the charm firmly, and went on. "Yes, I do. I wish I belonged to some other family. I wish it twice." Mark and Katherine and Martha gasped. This was the worst that had happened yet. They hardly dared look at Jane for fear she might start turning into someone else before their very eyes. But when they did look, there stood the same brown-haired, blue-eyed, snub-nosed Jane they had grown to know and love through the years. Nothing seemed to have happened. Maybe nothing had. Mark decided to find out. "Look here, old Jane Ice," he said, putting his hand on her arm and using a pet name that was reserved for unusual and serious moments. "You didn't mean it, did you?" "You let me go, you bully," remarked a prim, ladylike voice none of the children had ever heard before in their lives. "You horrid big boy. I don't like boys, and I don't like you." "Oh," cried Martha, turning pale. "She doesn't know us." "Of course she does," said Katherine. "You know me, don't you, dear? Kathy, we've been through so much together." "No, I don't know you, and I don't wish to. Your frock is soiled," said the voice that, to their horror, seemed to be coming out of Jane. "My mamma told me never to play with strange children." Martha began to sniff. "What an insanitary little girl," said the voice. "Tell her to use a handkerchief. She'll give me a germ." "Oh, what's the matter with her?" Martha's voice was rising to a wail. "It's not her fault," Katherine said, trying to be reassuring for Martha's sake. "It's the way she's been brought up, I suppose, by that other family she belongs to now. It does show what a good influence we've been, doesn't it? She was lots nicer under our tender care." "I don't believe it," said Mark. "She's just trying to fool us. Aren't you, Jane Ice?" "Don't call me that," said the voice. "That's not my name." "All right then," said Mark, turning on her suddenly. "If that isn't your name, then what is?" The strange girl who looked like Jane, yet was Jane no longer, seemed startled for a moment, as if she weren't quite sure of the answer. Then her face cleared. "My mother calls me her little comfort," she said. Mark made a gagging noise. Katherine looked disgusted. "To think one of us should have come to this," she mourned. "It would be an errand of mercy to put the poor thing out of her misery," said Mark. She, who was no longer Jane, was staring around the room. "I don't like this house," she said. "The furnishings are in poor taste. It is gaudy." Her lower lip began to tremble. "I want to go home." "Oh, you do you?" said Mark. "Well, I can fix that. No sooner said than done." And he made a dive for the pocket where he knew the charm lay concealed. But she, who was no longer Jane, pulled away and gave him a surprisingly hard slap for such a miminy-piminy ladylike type. "Take that!" she cried. "You are a thief as well as a bully." She glared round at them all. "You are a lot of badly brought-up children. You kidnapped me and now have tried to rob me. I'm going to tell my mother." And with these words, she flounced out into the hall and started down the stairs. By the time the others had recovered from their shock and dashed after her, she was in the art of mincing out the front door. Mark and Katherine took the stairs 3 at a time. Martha used the banister. But in the lower hall, Miss Bick leapt forth and barred the way. "No, you don't," she said. Not a soul leaves this house until the table's set for lunch. Well, there was nothing the children could do about this, and nothing that they had prepared to say. They didn't even point out that Jane had already left. As Katherine said afterward, the way Jane was acting, right then she probably didn't have a soul. But never was table set with such wild abandon, never did silver fly through the air with such great ease as it then flew. Hardly more than one precious minute had been wasted in idle drudgery before Mark and Katherine and Martha rushed out the front door and down the steps to the sidewalk and stood scanning the offing in all directions. Far down Maplewood Avenue, they could just make out a genteel figure in Jane's dress, picking its way along and toeing out in a way that the real Jane would have scorned to be seen doing in public. As they watched, the figure turned to the right into Virginia Street. And as they started to dash after it, a car drove up before the house, and Mr. Smith got out and held the door open for their mother. "Company for lunch," their mother called, blushing pink and looking embarrassed and pretty. "Where's Jane?" The three children looked at each other and then quickly looked away again. "We don't know exactly," said Katherine. "We think she's visiting somebody over on Virginia Street," said Mark, hoping that he spoke the truth and that she, who was all that was left of Jane, had not strayed farther. "Well, go and get her," said their mother, taking some interesting-looking packages from the car. "This is a party." The three children looked at the ground hopelessly. "Wait," their mother went on, not noticing. "You all go in the car and pick her up. That'll be quicker. I'll be breaking the news to Miss Bick about the party." And she started toward the house, her arms loaded with packages. Mark and Katherine and Martha waited till she was safely inside. Then they turned to Mr. Smith and all started to speak at once. Then they stopped and looked at each other again. "Shall we tell him?" Katherine asked. "Yes," Mark nodded decisively. "There comes a time in the affairs of men, and this is it." "I said we ought to all along," said Martha. "I said he'd know what to do. This'll prove it." And she and Mark and Katherine all piled into the front seat of the car and began telling Mr. Smith about the dread events of the morning. They didn't go into the reason for Jane's upset, though, or the way she felt about stepfathers, out of consideration for his feelings. And Mr. Smith didn't waste time in unnecessary questions, which proves, said Mark to Katherine afterward, that he would make an ideal step and not a Murdstone at all. He started the motor, and the car shot down Maplewood and turned into Virginia Street. She who was no longer Jane was no longer to be seen. "She must be in this block somewhere," said Katherine. "She hasn't had time to walk any farther." "What do we do now?" asked Martha. "The question is moot," said Mark. "She could be in any one of these houses." "We could holler fire and everyone would come running out," suggested Katherine. Let's not have any more fires or running," Martha shuddered, remembering certain past experiences. "Let's knock at all the doors and ask if they want to subscribe to the Literary Digest." "That's no good," said Mark, who had done this one summer to try to earn spending money. "All they ever say is no and then shut the door on you." Martha turned to Mr. Smith. "It's up to you," she said trustingly. Mr. Smith looked pleased and touched. He also looked a little nervous, as though he were hoping he might live up to their trust. He cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "first of all, does any of these houses look like the kind of house the family of that kind of girl would live in?" Mark and Katherine and Martha stared up and down the block. Luckily, it was a short one, with only 8 houses in it, 4 on each side of the street. Almost all the houses looked very much like their own. Comfortable, slightly shabby, family sort of houses, with an easy-to-get-along-with, lived-in look. All but one. The 8th house was made of cold-looking gray stone and sat primly on an impossibly neat emerald lawn that was shut off from the street by a forbidding hedge of evergreens. A small sign on the lawn said, "Please." The walk to the front door was of bright blue gravel, edged with some boring plants that looked as though they had never blossomed and didn't intend to. There were no croquet wickets on the lawn and no bicycles or kiddie cars sitting around the way there were in front of most of the other houses. "That's the one," Mark was positive. "It has to be. It looks just like her." He and Katherine and Martha and Mr. Smith got out of the car and advanced stealthily up the street till they stood confronting the gray stone house. No one was in sight. From within came the sound of someone practicing a difficult piece upon the piano. "That couldn't be Jane," said Martha. "She hates to practice." "I bet she doesn't now," said Mark. "We better not let her see us," said Katherine. "She doesn't seem to like us very well anymore." "If her new family's anything like her, I don't think they'll like us either," said Mark. He turned to Mr. Smith. "I guess it's still up to you, sir." Mr. Smith cleared his throat nervously again. "All right," he said, "I'll try." So Mark and Katherine and Martha hid behind the evergreen hedge, and Mr. Smith, after checking to make sure that no telltale parts of them were exposed to public gaze, squared his shoulders and marched bravely up the blue gravel walk and knocked on the front door with the imitation antique brass knocker. Now, I think that's a good stopping point for this long chapter, but if you come back soon, we'll find out who answers that door.